So we'll make a start. If looks like quite a few people have joined, as and when other people join, Alice is going to let them in. So I'm Lindsay Stroughton. I'm a member of the Nuclear IRM SIG Special Interest Group. I'm going to be doing the intros and introducing all the speakers and the closeout at the end, and I will host the Q&A and direct questions to people. So thank you for everyone for joining our joint event between the Nuclear SIG and the Infrastructure SIG. The topic of our session today is risk management culture. We want to talk a little bit about getting some industry insights from experts as we discuss leadership, threats, diversity and effective risk reporting. As I said, it brings together our nuclear infrastructure groups, and we're looking to view how we can work on risk culture together. We've got the agenda to run through today is we'll do a bit of an overview of the IRM for a couple of minutes. We have a safety share from Wes Cadbury, one of our infrastructure SIG members. And then we have two speakers, Wes and Horst, and a Q&A session at the end. So a little bit about the IRM. For those of you who don't know, who maybe all already aren't members, it's the leading professional body for enterprise risk management. We drive excellence in managing risks to ensure organisations are ready for opportunities and threats in the future. And we do it by providing internationally recognised qualifications and training and publishing research and guidance and professional standards. The IRM also now offers advice and advisory and guidance services as well. So if anybody's interested in any of those, we will post links to some of these in the chat on the side so that people have access to that information. And as I mentioned, the IRM also has a number of qualifications that it runs. We've got the International Certificate in ERM, International Certificate in Financial Services, Digital Risk Management and Supply Chain, and the International Diploma in Risk Management. So moving on to our speakers, we have two guest speakers today. We have Wes Cadbury, NDA Group ERM Risk Manager, and Wes is going to talk today a little bit about risk culture in the context of giving a practical assessment and his experience. We also have Horst Simon, Risk Culture Builder, and Horst is going to talk to us about how we build organisational risk culture. Once the two guest speakers have finished their sessions, we do have a Q&A panel at the end. Horst and Wes will both be on the Q&A panel, along with Lois Anderson, Lauren Ashley Boswell, Joanna Telfer and Martin Hughes. Can we ask that if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any point during the sessions. So if your questions relate to anything that Horst or Wes are presenting and speaking on, please feel free to put your question in the chat comments. And what we'll do is we'll pick all those up, and then when we get to the Q&A at the end, we'll direct Horst and Wes and the other panelists to the questions and hopefully answer them. There'll also be an opportunity for people to put their hands up at the end and ask any questions if you want to ask the panelists direct yourselves. The session is being recorded, so can we ask that people please keep your cameras turned off and yourselves muted, unless you are asking a question of the panel at the end. So I am going to hand over to Wes, who is going to give us a safety share before he goes into his session.
Thanks very much, Linz. I'll introduce myself properly in a minute when I get through to my slide deck, but certainly in the Infrastructure Special Interest Group, we always try to start our events with a safety moment, and the one in front of you there is one that we've used consistently across all our events for about the last 3 years, largely because it's still incredibly relevant, certainly in the construction and infrastructure sector. And it's to do with mental health and suicide rates among people who work in the construction sector. So did you know that working in construction, you are 6 times more likely to die from suicide than from a fall from height? A survey was undertaken, and from 2011 to 2015, rates of suicide among low-skilled workers in the UK construction industry were 1.6 times higher than the national average. Over 1,400 construction workers committed suicide in that time frame in the 4 years between 2011 and 2015. That's an average of nearly 4 people per day. And more than a quarter of construction employees in this survey had admitted to considering taking their own life, and that's only the ones that admitted to it. And I always think that in the infrastructure sector, certainly we've got some of the most aggressive, stringent physical health and safety regulations, but in my eyes, we're still lacking quite far behind when it comes to mental health. It doesn't get any better. This data from the 4 years 2011-15 has remained pretty consistent through future surveys. So one, just to think about when you've got colleagues who don't see themselves, and maybe just check in and make sure that they're doing okay. So I'm going to just take control of the screen if I can, and I'll get into my slides. Bear with me, sorry. So just let me know when you can see those come up on the screen.
Got them, Wes.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a bit about risk management culture. I'll take you through a practical example of when I tried to understand the risk management culture of an organisation that I was working in. So I'll run through who on earth I am, give you a bit of a background of me, a bit about what culture is, and also my favourite definition of what risk management culture is that I've picked up over the years. And then I'll go through some practical examples of how I've tried to understand and get some definition around the risk management culture of a particular organisation and the outputs, and hopefully some of the things that I say will resonate with any risk management professional on the call. So who am I? So Wes Cadby, I've had 21 years now in the infrastructure and nuclear sectors across a range of project delivery roles, project risk management roles, and in my later years, enterprise risk management roles, largely in the construction sector, but in the last 3 years, working in the nuclear sector, so currently with the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. I'm the former chair of the IRM's Infrastructure Special Interest Group. I'm now the deputy chair supporting our new chair, Danielle. I'm a fellow of the IRM, having gone through all of their qualifications, the certificate and the diploma. Been a member for about 13 years now. Since December 2022, I've sat on the board of directors for the Institute of Risk Management, supporting them in their expansion plans and their drive to remain the #1 professional body for risk management. And finally, I'm a huge advocate of building a positive risk management culture, which for me is either the biggest enabler or the biggest disabler to effective risk management in any organisation or project. So what is risk management culture? You only need to type that into Google, or if you're all modern and young, ChatGPT, to find out a definition about what risk management culture is. There's a few frameworks that people have developed. This one here, the IRM risk culture framework, uses an onion model, which shows layers of what takes us to a risk culture: personal predisposition to risk, personal ethics, behaviours, organisational culture, and ultimately the risk culture. We also have the ABC model, which I'm sure many of you will have seen, that attitudes shape behaviours and form culture, influence behaviours, influence attitude, and so on and so on. And the IRM go a little bit further and give us a definition, and they define it as a term describing the values, beliefs, knowledges, attitudes, and understanding about risk shared by a group of people with a common purpose. This applies to all organisations, including private companies, public bodies, governments, and not-for-profits. So I quite like those definitions, but a senior leader that I used to work for described it in a way that has always resonated for me since he said it. And it was this quote: "Any organisational culture, including its risk management culture, can be defined by the worst behaviour the senior leaders will allow the workforce to get away with." So it's quite a cynical definition of risk culture, but it's one that really resonated with me, because if an organisation or a senior leader isn't asking for risk management to be part of the fabric of a business or an organisation or a project, it's just not going to happen. People do health and safety risk management as a matter of course, because there are very severe consequences if they get it wrong. People can get hurt, people can go to jail, and so there's a price to pay for not doing it. Is it the same for enterprise risk management and project risk management? I'm not entirely sure it is. So measuring culture, my view of measuring culture. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And it's very difficult when you're dealing with people's emotions and people's viewpoints and people's opinions and people's ingrained ethics to measure what could be considered a culture. But there are some ways to be able to do it. If you have that data, even if it's qualitative in nature, it will show development areas and actions that can be implemented to close the gaps or to take you to your target risk management culture. For me, I need to understand the overall organisational culture as well as the risk management culture, because the two are walk hand in hand. So I'm going to take you through a practical example using a couple of models that I found were really useful in trying to understand those two parts of culture. So the two models that I used, one was called the double S model. So that looks at two things called sociability and solidarity, and it looks at organisational culture. And I think the outputs of that really suited the kind of answers that I was trying to find when I was looking at organisational culture. The other model that I used is the RM risk culture aspects model. So this looks specifically at factors that need to be in place that, if they are in place and they're working effectively, should mean that you've got a positive risk management culture out the back of it. So I'll come on to more about those two shortly. But for a bit of background and context about who I was trying to assess. So it was when I was working on a major infrastructure project. There were multiple suppliers working together, suppliers made up of tier 1, tier 2, all the way down to tier 3. So just imagine the sorts of maturity levels for formal risk management that exist in the tier 3 of our supply chains. It was an NEC form of contract, a relatively risk-free option, option F. For those of you who aren't familiar with NEC, it's badged as a collaborative form of contract. But really it just forces you to tell the other party that something might not be going right, otherwise you won't get paid for it. But in essence, it is a collaborative way of expressing risk conversations. An option F that sits underneath it is essentially creating somebody who's a route to market. So that person will procure all the bits of work throughout the market. And essentially that person gets paid for everything they do. Even if they do something wrong, they still get paid for the work that they've done. So it's a relatively risk-free option. There was multiple scope involved in this project. So we had everything from civils buildings, civil infrastructure, environmental mitigations, all the way through to demolition of assets. There was about 350 people working on the project. And there was one risk management resource. So you probably make up your own assumptions about whether you need a risk culture in a relatively risk-free option, whether one person to facilitate 350 people in the art of risk management is enough, but I'll get into what I did to trying to find this out. So my perception was that risk management was seen as a box ticking exercise. It was something that was required in the contract. It wasn't really taken too seriously. It wasn't provided any real discussion time at key forums such as progress reviews. It was a struggle to get the engagement to hold formal risk management discussions amongst any of the functional teams and the project delivery teams. The outputs created from the risk management process were not used to make any decisions, and they weren't used as a management tool. So any risk profile, any contingency amounts that were identified for projects weren't really being used, they were just being done. A saying that was often heard, we're a bit too busy to do risk at the moment. So the very words do risk fill me with dread, but the fact that people were saying they were too busy and they meant risk management, but to do risk management, again, sort of gives me some quite big assumptions on the culture that was present. Often heard people within the organisation state, this person is the risk manager, it is his job to do risk. And again, that statement, I'm sure there'll be many of you on the call that have heard similar things throughout your risk management careers, suggesting to me that they didn't understand the key roles, the responsibilities and the fundamentals of risk management and its accountabilities. So all of that, and I'm sure, well, I'm hoping you'll agree, that leads me to believe that the organisation did not have a positive risk management culture. So I wanted to get some tangible data to be able to put some improvements next to. It's very easy for me to have opinions on people's view of risk management. And as a risk management professional, I don't know whether it's just that we're cynics, But generally those things I'm sure ring true with yourself, and you probably know that when there's a risk culture that's good and when there is one that isn't. So I use this model, the double S model, and it looks a little bit like this. It looks at two things: sociability and solidarity. Sociability is all about how much people get on with each other, how much they like each other, how much they are willing to do things for each other. And solidarity is how focused they are on shared goals and mutual benefits and common tasks, how much silo working there is compared to how much collaborative working there is. So it was developed by Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones in 1998. It's a model that assesses those two dimensions. So the sociability one, assessing people how well they get on socially and whether they will want to do things for each other because they want to rather than that they have to. So using this model, a high sociability measure for this organisation would suggest to me that they would be engaged with the risk management process because they recognise it's part of the common good, and that they would attend required workshops and discuss risk when asked to, not just because they were forced to. A low sociability measure for this organisation would make me think that people would not support risk management because they want to, but only if they are forced to. And a very low sociability score may also indicate that people within the org may not support risk management at all. When it comes to solidarity, so this dimension assesses the common tasks, the shared goals, the collaboration that people need within that organisation. It assesses them on performance and goal achievement as the measure of success. So a high score in this would mean that goals and objectives are aligned across the organisation and that the workforce are incentivised to work in a particular way. A low measure for this would suggest that objectives are not aligned, that silo working is in place, and this would mean that people would concentrate their own delivery only without taking cognizance of the impact on others' objectives. So looking at that model, ideally, we want an organisation, or I want an organisation to be in the top right-hand corner, the communal. We like each other and we'll do stuff for each other. The bottom left-hand corner, fragmented, means that we don't really like the people we work with and we're not willing to do stuff for them. And also, we don't really care about their objectives because I've got my own stuff to do. And you can quite easily see, if that's the culture that's present, how that's going to play into engagement with the risk management process. Why did I choose this model? One, it was easy and I'm quite a simple chap. This one can also be done through your own structured observations rather than through survey. The second assessment tool that I'll come on to in a bit did require input from the workforce, and I was very conscious about overburdening the organisation with a number of different surveys. It enables me to make my own assessment of the organisational culture, but dependent on my own personal observations only, this assessment allows me to conduct the analysis without affecting the culture being assessed. So I've got my own views to work with. And it's a useful complementary tool, and it allowed me to enable myself to compare against my original visual observations about it being a box ticking exercise. So very simply, these are the questions that get asked as part of this. So they're quite simple questions, and there's no real metric for scoring other than your own view of what's low, medium, and high. But it's a very quick measure, and for me, a very effective measure. So you can see for sociability, the sort of things it's asking you is, do people here get along very well? Do people here like one another? People here often confide in one another about personal matters. And I think when people have a personal relationship like that, people they actually enjoy working with, you do find that they'll be more engaged in supporting them with the delivery of their objectives. So just weighting low, medium, and high, you can come up with a score for sociability. The same for solidarity. So does this group understand and share the business's objectives? Does work get done effectively and productively? Our collective will to win is high as a team, etc., etc. And you get a score off the back of it. So for the organisation that I was in, what did the outputs look like? They looked like this. They were sort of in the middle. So you sort of liked the people you're working with and you sort of understood the stuff they were doing, but it was nowhere near that top right-hand corner place that I really wanted the organisation to be in. It was firmly placed in the fragmented, which was the one that I didn't want. People don't really like each other and people aren't really understanding other people's objectives and how your own objectives impacts on them. So for me, that was quite eye-opening because it did cement my initial view of my view of the risk culture that was in operation. So now I wanted to understand a bit more about the risk culture. So I used this model, the risk culture aspects model, developed by a chap named Alex Hinson in 2010, recognises that culture cannot be directly measured, weighed or touched. It is a thing, it is a concept, it is a set of beliefs. But it does propose 8 aspects that are grouped into 4 themes. So 4 key themes that need to be in place to ensure a healthy risk culture. All these align to the organisation's strategic objectives. So what do they look like? One, and for me, the absolute 100% most important one, the tone at the top. So it's split into 2 parts, the 2 aspects. Risk leadership, so the clarity of direction. Senior management understand and set clear and consistent expectations for managing risk. They role model risk management. So it's not just the tone at the top, it's the tone at and from the top. Are they managing risks? And they're showing the workforce that they're managing risks. And a really important one, certainly in less mature organisations, I think, how senior leadership respond to bad news. So senior management should actively seek out information about risk events. They should recognise people that are open and honest about the things that might go wrong. Someone always said, I can't remember who it was, but someone I used to work with, that bad news is good news if it's early, because we can prepare for it. So how people respond to bad news is a key element of making a risk-aware culture. Governance. So risk governance, taking accountability. Management are clear about their accountability for managing risk, and role description, so the workforce understand their role and accountabilities for managing risk. The transparency of risk information as well. So timely communication of risk information across the org, and risk events are seen as an opportunity not a reason to get upset with people or to do a witch hunt. Competencies. So you can have all the best messaging from the top, you can have all the governance in place, but if you haven't got people who know how to manage risk or understand risk, then you're not going to get quality information. So risk resources. Do you have an empowered risk function? Does it have a defined remit and the support of leaders across the group? Is it able to challenge how risks are managed? Is it able to give an independent view of how risks are managed? And then competence across the workforce. So whether you've got a raft of risk management professionals, whether you've got a series of very competent risk champions, or whether your entire workforce has a minimum level of competence that allows them to discharge their risk management capabilities, you need that sort of level of competence to be able to get good risk management culture. And then finally, decision making. So regardless of people asking for it, regardless of the best governance in the world, regardless of the best experts in the world delivering risk management, are we actually using the outputs to do anything with it? So risk decisions. Are leaders seeking out risk information to support their decisions? Are businesses' willingness to take on risks understood and communicated, i.e. their risk appetite and how much risk they want to take in the pursuit of objectives? And is appropriate risk taking rewarded? So is performance management linked to risk taking? Has everyone got an objective in their performance pack saying that they need to be able to show and prove they're managing the threats and opportunities to their objectives? And leaders are supportive of those actively seeking to understand and manage risks. People identifying risks and showing them and communicating them should be recognised and rewarded. So the assessment looks a bit like this. I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but there is an easy 4-level assessment measure for these. And it's a typical kind of maturity model approach. So there's 4 statements per aspect. On the left, you've got the blue ones. That's the gold standard. That's where you want to be to prove you've got a positive risk culture. And the ones further to the right in the red are the ones you want to try and avoid that show they don't. So these are the actual results of my assessment that I did within this organisation. So looking at the risk leadership, a total of 71 people that responded said that the statement is not possible to describe a tone at the top or leadership expectations on how risks are managed. 63% felt that the responding to bad news element was best aligned to the statement. The communication of bad news is sporadic. Attempts are made to encourage early communication of risk information. It is recognised that this is important, but processes are still to be formalised and embedded. And then I've got some anecdotal quotes, and I wonder how many of these resonate with people on the call. I'm never asked what my risks are by the leadership team, only whether I'm on track for delivery. None of the senior meetings have an agenda item regarding risks or risk management. I will only report bad news when it has happened. Until then, I will try and make sure it doesn't happen. I am nervous when things aren't going well, as I think I will be looked upon as incompetent. So playing into those things from the previous slide about what a good culture looks like, the inverse of them for me is exactly what those statements are saying. We're moving over to governance, a little bit better in terms of the scores in the yellow ones. So 62% of people felt that the best risk governance statement for this was that accountabilities for managing risk are partly defined. Some key regulatory and compliance aspects are well defined, but the organisation is siloed. The risk management and reporting process is in place, but not clearly defined or widely understood. A total of 71 respondents felt that risk transparency was best aligned to this statement. Risk information is effectively communicated on certain specific issues related to regulatory or compliance aspects. Communication of risk information tends to be one way, bottom up, with little feedback or leadership direction. It supports a tick box approach. Again, some quotes. I am unsure what my role is in terms of risk management. I thought this was the risk management lead's job to do. I attend risk workshops when I can, but other than that, I don't think I have too much to do else with risk management. I receive risk registers from the risk team, but they often contain out-of-date information, and the risk profile has changed before they're issued. I receive risk registers via email, but I rarely, if ever, read them. Sorry, it's bringing back memories listening to these again. Moving on to competency. So the competence, the resources available for risk, and the general competence across the organisation. 69 people felt the risk resources statement best aligned to the risk function's role is defined, but it does not cover all aspects required for an effective governance process to be implemented. The risk function does not have the breadth and depth of skills to support all aspects required to develop an effective risk management culture. 71 felt that risk competence was best aligned to this statement. Competency in risk management is not recognised as a key skill. Training and communication programmes are not coordinated and address specific issues within the context of specialisms and silos of risk. So again, some more quotes. I don't know why we need a risk management function. We manage our own risks. And that is the dream. That is the dream, to get to a point where a risk management function isn't needed. But I don't think this person particularly knew what they were on about when they said it. I'm not sure who does what in terms of risk. We have health and safety management everywhere. So again, a discrepancy between people thinking that risk management is all to do with health and safety rather than project risk and enterprise risk. I've undertaken risk management in previous roles, so I know what a risk is, but I've never received any risk management specific training, formal or otherwise. I'm not expected to manage risks. I'm expected and was employed to manage designs. That one always fills me dread, because a whole design is there to remove hazards and remove risk in the construction of an asset. And the final one, so decision making, two big reds when it came to the use of risk information. 71% felt the risk decisions were best aligned to the statement. Business decisions are typically taken in isolation from explicit risk factors. The evaluation of risk and reward is done in an ad hoc and intuitive manner. 76 of people felt that rewarding appropriate risk taking was best aligned to the statement. Risk awareness and taking behaviours are not recognised as valued and are not explicitly rewarded. So some more quotes. We get informed of decisions once they're made and have little or no input into whether we believe it's the right direction or decision. In my view, there have been numerous decisions that have been made and then reversed and changed. When they don't appear to be working, it's all a bit gung-ho sometimes. And the final two, I don't see it as a key element of my role, and my objectives don't state anything to do with it. And the final one, the leadership team appear very risk averse, so I don't take any risks that I don't have to. So again, I wonder how many of those resonate with people throughout their risk management career. The beauty of this model is that if where we've scored red on these, you only need to look to the left, and it gives you a roadmap for what things need to be in place to get yourself to a positive risk management culture. So if your senior leadership are willing to listen to this, the outputs of this model, even if it is quite red, like the one that I did, this gives them the hook to say, you know, where do you want your risk culture to be? Because these are the things you're going to have to implement, invest in. So what did we do about it? Some quite simple things, really, to be honest, because there was quite a mountain to climb. Risk management culture can improve and drop incredibly quickly. You only need one bad reaction to bad news to completely derail a risk management culture. You only need one person that doesn't really agree with risk management in a senior role to come in and completely derail any good work that you've done. So it's something that always needs care and attention. To improve sociability, believe it or not, we did social events. We literally took people out for beers because nobody ever bonded. Nobody ever did anything outside of work. The only thing these people had in common with each other is that they walked around on the same bit of carpet for 8 hours a day and got frustrated at exactly the same printer on a daily basis. What this did was further improve solidarity because there was a personal relationship. Someone knew someone on a personal level, and they were more likely to do something for them to support their objectives. In terms of the tone at the top, some very simple tactical things. The risk management policy was refreshed and briefed out just to make people understand it is a mandatory part of activity. We had recognition of ownership of key principal risks by our senior leaders. So we made sure that they were actively talking about the risks that they were managing. And one really important one for me was the refresh of language. So changing the name risk management to margin enhancement, it's amazing what that can do to a member of the supply chain in wanting to get on board with risk management. When they realize they're enhancing profits and potentially bonus scores, it certainly changes the dynamic and the engagement. For governance, we did a refresh of the RACI, so we made sure people understood what their responsibilities and accountabilities were. We introduced a stage gate with a requirement for QRA output. So for any of these projects, people had to go through a risk management exercise and provide a percentage of their estimate that show that it's a risk-based assessment of their estimate. We had a risk communication strategy and a risk management keep in touch board, a kit board. So every week, as part of our weekly keep in touch meetings, we also had a 15 to 20 minute risk management conversation about the big risks that we're worried about, the emerging risks, which got people engaged and got people talking about it. And then competencies, a simple training program for staff on the basics and fundamentals. How do you write a risk? What do you need to do with a risk? How do you quantify a risk? We also developed training for the risk management software to drive accountability to where it should be. Too often, only the risk management functions have access to the software. That means that people who don't have access only need to think about risk when the risk manager comes along. And that, for me, is not a good sign of a positive risk management culture. But did it work? Did it work in decision making? TBC, it's been a few years. There were arguments over whether the percentage of contingency was too big. So when somebody came and said, 15% of my estimate is contingency, is risk contingency, people said, that's a bit too high, we can't have that. That, for me, is a good conversation, but not the right conversation. They should be looking at saying, what are the risks that are driving that up? What are the things we need to be really worried about? And risk ownership debate. You'd like to think a debate around risk ownership is quite productive and quite proactive. It was actually because people were trying to avoid the management of risk. So although this got to the point where people were having a conversation and decisions about risk management, I still wasn't convinced that the culture that was driving that was the right one. But all in all, risk management got onto the table. It was starting to be discussed, and it did form part of conversations. So I think I've rabbited on for long enough. I hope that was useful. The slides will be going out to people. And of course, if you want to talk about any of those models or the detail behind it or the application of it, I'm happy to talk separately outside of this. So I'll hand back to yourself, Lindsay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Wes. We've got some couple of good questions in the chat, so I've captured those and I'll direct them to you at the panel session at the end. Some good talking points there.
Thank you.
Horst, when you're ready, you can start speaking. Do you want to share your own slides, or is Alice sharing them for you?
You can share them for me.
Brilliant.
Because
Thank
if you have them all there, that would be great. I will just say, and on the next one, so we can go forward. So I think that's going to be easy. So yeah, we're ready to to go. I'm going to talk about building it in an organizational culture. And if I just glance off to the left, I'm not ignoring you guys. I'm just running two screens so that I can see what I'm doing. So for this, I'm just going to talk about building an organizational risk culture. I think to add on to what Wes has just shared with us, I'll cover a little bit more of a practical insight on how I've been doing it and how I've and the things I've developed over a period of time. So if we can go to the next one, Lindsay, that's just a little bit of background on me. I've been in the banking and professional services for more than 40 years. Started off in a commercial bank, and then lived in Lesotho for a couple of years looking at banking operations, and then lived in Dubai for 12 years where I was looking after operational risk for some banks, ended up being on the Moody's Analytics global training team for risk. And then eventually we moved back to Namibia, where I'm speaking to you from, Windhoek. Back home. So after so many years in the industry, I came back home to build risk culture for one of the financial services institutions here. I'm also involved in a few other things around the world. The paper where Wes quoted the assessments from, I was a part of putting that paper together with the IRM group in 2012. Late last year into this year, we've done another global risk culture study with the ACCA and published those results, and also a lot more on maturity assessments, and that in those papers. You can just Google ACCA risk culture and you'll find them as well. I got an award in 2019 from the Institute of Risk Management in South Africa for the contribution I made in Africa. Back in the old days when I was a consultant in the UAE, I normally got two questions. The one question was, where are we? And the next question was, what do we do next? And what Wes has shared with us, I used to do similar things as a consultant, and then you get that and you present it to the executives and they just tell you, oh, that's your opinion of our business. So I developed an online assessment tool that was actually their own staff's assessment of what is going on the ground. That is commercially available from Genius Methods now. I still use it from time to time. What's interesting, Wes, is on the comment you made around the industry. We did use this tool many years ago in Dubai for an engineering firm, and they did not have a risk department in place. They had to get this third-party assessment to actually submit with a tender for a big oil pipeline in Iraq. And we did the assessment for them, and it came out pretty good. Without a risk department, they were still very good at managing risk, and they had a very mature risk culture without even having a formal risk department. So it is interesting that where people really take ownership of it, you will see the results without even a major risk department. I'm passionate about building risk culture. I've been involved with that for many years and developing things around that. Currently, I'm still associated with some companies in the UAE, the UK, the US, and obviously here in Namibia. We also started the Dubai Center for Risk and Innovation at the British University in Dubai many years ago, before I left. And they focus there on actually training and building capacity within risk management and risk culture. And people can also do a research-based PhD in risk management through that. If we can move on to the next one, we'll just talk about the definitions. The one Wes has already given you, the one that came from the documents we put together in 2012. And the other one is the one from the North Carolina State University's ERM initiative. I like both of them because they both talk about the values and the beliefs and the behaviors and that common understanding and that common purpose. And that is what it's all about. It is about how do we capture the hearts and the minds of employees. Back in 1993, The Economist, they already had an article, and they said, in the future, the competitiveness will be in the hearts and the minds of the employees, not in just the customers. So really how people think and respond to a situation of risk, that is the key element. That is why a whole lot of the things that we've done before just doesn't work anymore. The whole 3 lines of defense, they changed to the 3 lines concept, and those kind of things, they just don't work because they break the organization up in silos. We never trained that so-called first line any risk management skills. We always just trained the second line. Many risk departments' sole existence is around producing a risk report. And then very often that report only goes to the top. And I've said many times, when a risk report only goes to the top, it goes through what I call a process of sanctification. It gets better the higher it goes, which is totally contrary to what we want to try and achieve with a risk culture. So what is risk culture building? If we can move on to the next one, this is my definition of what my job is, what risk culture building is. The training of mind, heart, and of personal character to respond effectively to a situation of risk and take the right decision to mitigate, control, or optimize risk to the advantage of the organization. So it's not just about mitigation and control, and you will see my big X over the old risk management or the current existing risk management process of identify and quantify and look at the controls and all of that. That's not what it's about. It's about the decisions people take. And I think Wes also alluded to that in the previous part. It is about the decisions people take and how those decisions will be to the advantage of the organization. We can never get everybody to think the same way, but we can get everybody to think what is best for the organization at that specific point in time. Just a quote at the bottom there: you can't do today's job with yesterday's methods and still be in business tomorrow. When we lived in the Middle East, I very often got that. Oh, we've been doing this for 20 years. Why do we need to change? No, you definitely need to change, because if you do it for the next 5 in the same way, you will be out of business. The whole world is moving on, so we need that new mindset for the new and better results. We need each and every employee to think about the management of risk in his and her job every day. We often find that we do these reports and they go up to mostly a risk committee or even up to the board of directors, and they will sit there for hours to talk about whether something should have been red, amber, green, pink, or orange as at the end of the previous quarter. So if you drive your car down to the coast and you only look in the rearview mirror, you will not get very far. But many people today still run their businesses like that. Last month's risk report is important, and they just sit and for hours discuss what color something should have been at the end of the previous month. So if we look at the next slide and some of the risk culture building principles, these are just the underlying factors that I've built into what I do, and we'll touch a little bit later on from process to purpose, the way forward. But these are the underlying principles. It must support decision-making, priorities, and business goals. We talked about that. Wes also talked about that. It's all about the decision-making and the way people think about risk. It must have a return on investment. I said at a conference in Dubai once, if your risk department does not add more value than what it costs to have them, get rid of them, because it doesn't make business sense. I did have a crowd around me during the tea break, wanting to know how can I say that, because it's the cost of doing business and it's a cost center. That's nonsense. We got to move on to the value that we add through the management of risk. Obviously, we want to in this case, also get the risk department small and get the people's knowledge and response to risk better. It must be tailored and responsive to the organizational culture. There is definitely no one size fits all. You have to build it onto the existing organizational culture, and very often you have to fix the organizational culture before you can really build and improve risk culture on that. Building risk culture in the organization is also not a project, or it's not an implementation. It is a process of building, and it can only stop when you go out of business. It will never stop otherwise. It's an ongoing process. You can make progress, but you can also fall into reverse with these kind of things. We already talked about linked to results and the achievement of results, and the value it must add through decision making. It must be flexible and can adjust quickly to change. We hear more and more in the marketplace and with the practitioners talking about agile risk management and more agility, where things decisions are taken quicker. The pace of change and the size of change is not slowing down. I have a slide that I use in my training sessions, and I've been using it for the last 15 years, and it's still relevant. The size of change and the speed at which things are changing is forever increasing. Controls within the risk appetite and the formal sanctioning process. I think one of the key elements I found when building risk cultures in organizations or advising them on how to do that is very often people don't even know what the risk appetite is. So I relate it back to the speed limit. If you have no clue what the speed limit is, you're just going to drive at whatever you want to. Now, generally in most countries, it's 100, 120 kilometers per hour. So if the speed limit is 120 kilometers per hour, that's the risk appetite that is set by the government, taking a whole lot of factors into consideration. If you then drive down for a weekend, you're not gonna drive at 60 kilometers per hour where everything is green. If you're a law-abiding citizen, you wanted to then drive at about 119, which is just under or just within the risk appetite. But very often, because we don't tell people what the risk appetite is, they cannot take the right decisions. We can train them forever to take better decisions. They will not take the right decisions if they don't know what the risk appetite is. So if you want to build an effective risk culture, you really need to make sure that people know what the risk appetite is, and that they know they want to operate at the higher end of the risk appetite, not at the bottom where everything is green. And then the last thing is definitely every employee is a risk manager. That is the fourth pillar. I'll briefly talk about the pillars I use to build risk culture, but that's the fourth pillar. Every employee is a risk manager. Over the years and building that system, I've looked at, you can go to the next one, thanks. I've looked at the levels of maturity, and I've studied a whole lot of these things, and generally people have come up with 5 levels. I've just defined the 5 levels a little bit in a little bit more detail. And you will notice from these, it's definitely about the level of the people caring. You know, you can have brilliant organizations with brilliant structures and boxes and lines of authority. If people don't care, it won't work. And you can have very disorganized organizations, and if people care, it will actually work. So part of building an effective risk culture and looking at those levels of maturity, it is linked not just to the knowledge and the way people think, but it's also linked to the level in which people care. Now, most organizations sits around this typical risk culture. People just do things because the policies and procedures and things are in place. But I think all organizations putting in a lot of effort into this would really strive to, or need to strive to really get to at least the effective risk culture, where people care enough to think about the risks on their jobs every day. I've often found when we do awareness sessions and that, and I've not been able to find out why, but for some reason, people will manage all the risks associated with getting to the office on time. And the minute they walk through the door and start to do their job, they forget about the management of risk. So we need to look at that. How do we get people to continuously think about risk in all the decisions that they take? And there's a whole lot of things that influence that. I'll briefly just talk about them because it's important to think about them when you want to do this. Everything will go back to one of the three worldviews. The way a person think and respond to a situation of risk goes back to the worldview of that person. Now, we generally have three worldviews. You have honor versus shame, which is more of the Eastern, Middle Eastern cultures. You have guilt versus innocence, which is more of the Western cultures. And you have power versus fear, which is more of your tribal kind of cultures. Now, in many organizations, you have a mix of those, but the way a person think about risk will go back to one of those. And then you have all kinds of other things that influence it. Which generation they are in will influence the way they think about risk. Education, emotions, all those kind of things play a role. So people need to be made aware of the things that influence their decisions and how to work around those so that they take the best decision for the organization. Just like on the generation thing, when I grew up, your parents told you you find a good company and you stick with them for life until you get that gold watch and the long service award. Nowadays, the average 30-year-old is at least 3 jobs with 2 different companies. So the way they think about risk and respond to risk is very different. And we need to be aware of all these things that influence it. The 150 odd unconscious biases that's been identified also play a role in how you think about the management of risk. So let's see if we can go the next one, from process to purpose. I would really, you'll recall a few slides back, I had my big cross over the old and current risk management process. Those things are largely based on gathering historic information, and those things then produce those backward-looking results, which we all sent up to the top, and they sat for hours and discussed. It is important that we move away from that. Many of the risk management systems that's on the market today, in my mind, in my view, is just very expensive historic data collection tools. It gives you a picture of risk at a point in the past. Managing risk is about the decisions, as we've heard, and the way people respond to those situations of risk. So that traditional functional mindset is one of the significant barriers to change. So if you want to build an effective risk culture, you definitely need to start at the top, and you need to do that mindset change from a process of risk management to the work of the effective management of risk. Everyone looking at the negatives and exploiting the positives at all levels in the business. And you cannot control that. You can only teach that by awareness. You need to train everybody in the organization, the basic risk management skills, and you need to be aware of how they think about risk and how they then will respond to a situation of risk. We often hear from consultants that you got to have a business continuity plan. And then the next thing is they'll tell you, you have to test that plan. Now, I've never in my 40-odd years seen any disaster following anybody's plan. So it's not about your plan. It is not about testing your plan. It is how each and every person in your business will respond to that situation of risk when it actually happens. So spend the money on training the people rather than writing reams and reams of documents and testing plans. Yeah, we had an interesting fact or an interesting conversation the other day. We were doing a fire drill evacuation of the building, and in our building, the fire escape lands on the first floor into the parking area, and then you have to walk down the ramp. And as we were walking down the ramp to the ground floor, somebody said, "Oh, so what if all these cars down here were on fire?" Which is interesting. We've been testing this plan for as long as we were in the building, and nobody said, what if all these cars in the basement is on fire and the cars on the ground floor are on fire? What then? How do we get past this? So if we go to the next one, Lindsay, I think the effective management of risk, the next slide. It's about that ability. Okay, if we can. Okay, I'll just continue to talk until we get there. Oh, there we are. There are only two options: make progress or make excuses. And for me, the effective management of risk lies in that ability to look at the behaviors and inspire more of the behaviors we want, both the behaviors we want to encourage and those we want to avoid. Very often we look at business and people have got a black book that they keep on everything they want to avoid, but hardly ever do we actually look at the behaviors we want to encourage. We want people to be aware of the management of risk and how to think about it. We want people to be aware of what influence the way they think about management of risk and respond to situations of risk. So we want to encourage those kind of behaviors. And again, if you are building this in your business or in your organization, you must look at what is there that already exists. Have you got the missions and values and those kind of things that are already there? And how do you build on top of that? Because people often debate and start to say things like, there is no such thing as risk culture. It's just corporate culture. No, it's not. You can have a corporate culture and do nothing with regards to risk culture, in which case it will just remain the way we do things around here without thinking about risk. So if you build an effective risk culture on top of that, then you actually have each and every employee looking at the management of risk every day. And that's where we will achieve success. We won't achieve success by looking and discussing last month's risk report. Generally, when I build this in organizations, I mentioned the 4 pillars. Pillar 1 is think differently. You must get every employee to think like a risk manager. I use the example of a car accident very often. And then I ask them, what's the first thing you do when you're one of the people on the pavement? And then people will say, oh, we'll take a picture for Facebook, or we'll phone the police, phone the ambulance. But in fact, the very first thing you should do when you think like a risk manager is you should put out those red triangles. You don't want a 2-car accident to become a 20-car accident. And then the second pillar, after thinking differently, the second pillar is get the whole picture, which means look beyond the obvious things. Look beyond what is just in front of you. Michelle Wooker calls those the gray rhinos, those things that are right in front of us and we choose to ignore them. We got to look beyond just the obvious things, and we got to make sure that we can see what is coming. We got to look through the windscreen. You can have a brilliant risk dashboard. You can have a brilliant risk system giving you a rear view mirror image of the past. If you don't look through the windscreen, you're going nowhere. So the second pillar is get the whole picture, look beyond the obvious things. The third pillar is building your risk intelligence network, or risk nervous system, I used to call it. It operates just like the human nervous system. You get risk information from everywhere, but you also share that risk information with everybody. I think Wes alluded to the risk conversations. Risk conversations are more important than risk reports. And we need to look at that and building those risk nervous systems. And the last pillar is every employee is a risk manager. And that's what we ultimately want to achieve. We want everybody, as they sit and do their jobs or stand and do their jobs every day, to think about risks and to think about what is the best decision I can make in this situation of risk to the benefit of the organization. So if we can go to the last slide, Lindsay. Those who don't understand the risks or miscalculate them will just be exploited by those who understand them better. So if you still need to convince your executives and your leadership that risk culture is important, just tell them this. If you don't understand it or you miscalculate it, those who are better will just exploit you. Thank you very much. I'm open to the questions and that in the Q&A session, but this is what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you, Horst. That was some really useful, insightful information there. So our next session is, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, but we also have some questions that were sent in advance. So could I ask the panelists to put their videos on and unmute yourselves, please, so that everyone can see you. I think Joanna hasn't joined us yet. She wasn't available for the first part of the session, but we are running a little bit ahead. So what I've done is I have just dropped a note to Joanna so she may join us. In the meantime, before I direct the questions, would each of the panelists like to introduce yourselves, please?
I think they know Wes and me.
Okay, I'll go first then. My name is Martin Hughes. I'm a risk manager working for Faithful and Gould, currently working on nuclear new build projects, Sizewell C and HPC. And I also have the honour of representing the IRM nuclear SIG today.
I'll follow on from Martin. I'm Lauren Ashley Boswell. I am representing F&G too, so I work for F&G, and I'm currently working on the High Speed 2 Phase 2 at the moment. But I'm here today just to support and I guess just answer any of the questions whilst in industry at the moment and give my experience and my opinions on risk culture in particular.
I'm Lois Anderson. I also work for Faithful and Gould, and I'm currently working on HS2 as well, but in Phase 1.
Thank you, everybody. So the first question I'm going to put this to any of the panelists who want to answer this one. So feel free to volunteer. One of the questions is, in your experience, what are people's perceptions of risk culture? So do you feel that businesses and individuals actually understand what it is and why it's important?
Well, I'll have a go. I think if you ask anybody in an organisation what their risk culture is or their view of risk culture, I think they'll tell you they absolutely 100% are always managing risk, and they probably are. And I think there's a difference between risk management and the management of risk, and there needs to be a balance between the two. Everybody manages risk every single day in their job, but throwing a risk register in front of them and asking them to complete it, it might not fit in with their ideals of how well they manage risk on a daily basis. So I think people's own perception of their own risk culture will always be that they've got an incredibly positive one. I don't know if they care whether it fits in with a bit of formality and a bit of consistency across it. That's how I'd say it in a way.
I think from my experience, people's perception of risk culture is the attitude and understanding of others that really relate to the overall risk awareness of the organisation. People's ability to take risks and their ability to actually perform risk management, something similar you've just mentioned there, Wes, i.e. performing risk management and risk awareness. I guess people's perception of risk culture actually, from my opinion, varies throughout organisations and I guess at different levels of the organisations as well. In my experience, some are engaged, some are not, some ask questions, some don't. Some are inclined to want to know more, others just generally lack interest. And for me, it's about finding the right balance and keeping it simple and straightforward. As a risk manager, I feel it's my duty to ensure that during any of the meetings that I facilitate, that all attendees are aware of their purpose, their value, to let them know that they're in a safe space for them to engage, switch on, and they can air the thoughts and suggestions openly and honestly. And for me, I guess it's about creating an environment that has a buzz, a sense of excitement, an incentive, because I know from my experience, without incentive, people don't show up. And those positive effects of creating that type of environment feed into other areas of the business, which helps to naturally influence the culture that we're all aiming to achieve. My ultimate goal personally throughout my career is to have risk management at the tip of everybody's tongue, at the forefront of their mind, and definitely to be a discussion point when making those decisions, those really big decisions and even small decisions, because everything has risk associated to it, positive and negative.
I think what we've seen in the recent survey is, we got to keep in mind we've done that just after sort of to the end of COVID. So there was a lot of focus by many organizations on employee health and well-being and that. So generally, most people responded to say that their risk culture improved. But until you start to scratch a little bit deeper, and then I think it's like Wes also said, people will generally say, oh, we're okay, we got a good risk culture. But if you really start to measure it and you really start to look at what is under the surface, there's a lot that can be improved. I've worked with many organizations where they've said, oh, we have a good risk culture. And then you scratch a little bit deeper and you find that that good risk culture only exists within the risk function. It doesn't exist outside of the risk function. So it's really perception, and it's a lot that you need to take into consideration when you actually build the plan to make progress.
For me, I think in the past there's been quite a negative risk culture, which is something that's changing. I think some people historically have perceived risk as a bit of a waste of time or a bit of a dark art. But from my perspective, this perception is something that's changing because it's getting worked on quite a lot across organisations. More communications being had, more understanding. And I think it is changing slowly, and organisations are focusing more on improving risk culture within themselves.
So for me, I think it's very much industry specific. I've worked in aviation and I've worked in nuclear. Both tend to be heavily regulated. You get a better chance of building your risk management culture, but we still have the same challenges across whatever the industry is with growing and embedding that risk management culture and keeping it going. It's like a plant. You have to nurture it and water it and feed it and fuss it.
I've got a little bit of there's a question in the chat that's probably quite a good, it was a follow-on one to one that you've just mentioned there, Martin, about it varies across sectors. Do you find it varies across different levels in the organisation as well?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. Very much so. It's, at the moment, being in the construction industry, it varies. I find the senior management tend to talk about risk management and risk culture, but they don't really push the lower levels. They'll scrutinise a cost report, they'll scrutinise a schedule, and they'll have a quick look at the risks, but they tend to run out of time maybe at a performance meeting, because let's face it, risk management's always the last slides in a presentation. It's the last thing to be talked about. I'd like to change that, because let's face it, if things are going wrong or they've got the potential to go wrong, you need to be talking about them first and foremost. Yeah, it does, unfortunately.
Isn't it? Yeah. Before I move on to the next question, I noticed that Joe Telfer has now joined us. So Joe, do you want to pop your camera on and introduce yourself before I move on to the next question?
I'd love to. Now, how do I put the camera on? That's
Bottom
the next
left.
question. Bottom left, I've got start video. I
That's
don't
the
think I
one.
want.
That's
Oh,
the
really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, brilliant. You learn something new. Hi, everyone. Lindsay, thank you for the invitation. I'll just do a quick introduction. I'm Jo Telfer. I work at Sellafield Limited and I'm head of behavioural insights. I'm an organisational psychologist and my interests are behaviour change, culture change, all that sticky and lovely and tricky stuff. So really excited to join you for the last part of your session.
Brilliant, thank you, Joe. So the next question, I think what I might do is put this one to you, Joe, first. So I know when we had conversations about joining, you mentioned that you don't specifically deal with risk culture, but it is about culture changes in general. So this question is about how do we shift the culture? And are there any examples you can share of where organisations have successfully been able to do that, or any examples of where organisations have tried to change the culture but it's failed, and what are the pitfalls that people should be thinking about and kind of trying to avoid?
They're big questions. How long have I got? Kind of 3-4 hours? Is that
Yeah,
all
as
right?
long as you like. You've got useful insight.
I don't think you'd thank me for that. What I can do is talk quickly about some trapdoors that people fall into when thinking about how to change a culture or how to change behaviours. Maybe that might be the first start of the conversation here. But keep me right, Lindsay, if this is what you and your colleagues would like or not like. The first thing to say is I'm not very keen on that word culture. It's one of those words that I think almost over the years we've used too much. So it might have lost its meaning to many people. And I don't know what presentations you've had earlier, so forgive me if I'm stepping on other colleagues' toes who have evangelised about the wonderfulness of culture. I genuinely don't know what other colleagues have said. I'm not keen on use of the word culture just because of its connotations. And also culture can be a big fat elephant. And I think it's quite off-putting for people when you say, come on, we need to change the culture. And how on earth do you even start to conceptualize something like that? So the first thing I always talk about when I'm working with a team or with a department or with an individual, with a leader, when they say, I don't quite know what's wrong, but it's something about the culture and please help me change the culture, is to be really boring about it and say, okay, what do you want? What do you mean by culture? What does it look like now? And what do you want it to be? And by culture, I always end up using language of behaviours and language of what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? So what are the things that you currently are hearing from your colleagues? And also what are the things coming out of your own mouth? And that really exemplifies your culture or your climate at the moment. Is that fit for purpose? Is that suiting you well? Is it helpful? Or maybe in some areas it isn't. So then, of course, the next question is, let's go in the TARDIS. I'm a Doctor Who fan. Let's go in the TARDIS in 2 years or 5 years' time. What are the kind of things that you want to be hearing from your colleagues, from your managers, from your executive team? And also, what do you want to be coming out of your own mouth in 5 years' time? And what are the things you want to be seeing? Do you want to be seeing people interacting differently? Do you want to be seeing, I heard, was it Martin? I just caught the end of what you said there about risk always comes at the end of the agenda. It's my experience too, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. But maybe in 5 years' time, that's one of the things you want to see differently. That risk actually comes at the beginning of the agenda because it's a fundamental part of the rest of the conversation that needs to be had. So it's really understanding before we get carried away about how do we change a culture, think about the what. Actually, what do we mean by culture? And really, what do we want it to look like? And what are the behaviours involved in the culture? And then in terms of changing the culture, and I'll just say this and then I'll go on mute, I don't want to talk too long, is there's a secret I'll share with you about changing culture. And this is a secret according to Joe Telfer, nobody else's secret. This is just my world and my experience. And the secret to changing culture is there is no secret. It's boring. It's not sexy. That's a technical change management term. It's not at all sexy. It's all about doing 1,000 things differently, maybe, but you can only do these 1,000 small things differently if you know what differently is that you're striving after.
Brill, thank you very much, Jo. Is there anything any of our other panelists would like to add to any of that? No? Brill. Right. I'll move on to one of the other questions. So one of the next questions, and specifically this one came up during your speaking session, Wes, was how much of the risk manager's role is creating movement in terms of forcing sociability and solidarity, so i.e. joining people, getting them to engage, sharing objectives. And the example that Tom gave when he asked the question was, unfortunately, has had to leave us, so hopefully we'll be able to watch the playback, the answer of his question, was that in some areas such as large projects, people often work in silos, so stopping that can be a challenge.
Yeah, so how much of the role of the risk manager is it to improve sociability and solidarity? I think as much as anyone else, to be honest, but I think we're as risk management professionals, we're in a gifted position in that we have more remit to go and talk to everyone up and down the hierarchy and across the business. And so we will probably hear more things than most other people working in an organisation or in a project. So I think we have an additional responsibility to connect the dots, make sure people are aware of other things that are going to impact their objectives, and try and drive people together. It's not about writing it down on a risk register all the time. It's about making one person talk to another person, so they don't even have to create a risk, they just solve a problem there and then. So I think we've got as much of a role in doing it, but I think we maybe have a greater responsibility to use the remit of our role to drive that, I think.
If any other panelists want to add anything, feel free to speak up if you want to add anything.
So Wes makes a really good point now. Sorry. Wes makes a good point now. It was only last Monday I was in a risk workshop, and it happens time and time again. You sometimes wonder that these guys actually talk to each other outside of your risk workshops, because they're sharing knowledge, they're asking questions, they're finding stuff out that the risk management process has encouraged that engagement, that interaction, and that speaking. And to be honest, the working from home doesn't help. I know we're all, we're embracing the hybrid working with a couple of days in the office and a couple of days at home. I think we do miss those conversations that you have walking around the office. But yeah, the number of times the risk management process gets people speaking after all these years still surprises me.
I could definitely agree with that. I've always found that risk management has been the integral part to allow everybody to come to a table or theoretical table, if it's virtual, or an in-person workshop, where people that have not actually spoken in months upon months, but that's the opportunity of which they are using that meeting to engage with their other colleagues, whether that's passing on your design to the construction team, whatever it might be. I've always found with the risk workshops at that moment, at that point in time, where people come together to have these harmonious conversations, and they actually develop very, very good responses and mitigations, and they resolve problems proactively in these types of meetings. Risk management is integral, and this is exactly where people speak and find their voice, and we encourage that and we facilitate that. And we just continue to ask why, what, when, how. I do genuinely think it's our responsibility to encourage those conversations and to encourage social interaction as well. I'm a big fan of in-person workshops, and I always will be. Maybe that's the way I've been brought up. Technical and virtual meetings just don't give me that tangible insight. You can't read people very well. Too many distractions for me personally, and I just like to get to know people individually and collectively.
Good. I think I can maybe add a lesson that I've learned over the years. And I once was in a company where they also did the risk workshops and risk identification sessions with all the different departments individually. But the day when we started to say, let us look at the end-to-end processes, and we put people from different departments together to look at the end-to-end process. We found so many risk aspects came out where there was duplication of controls. For example, the salespeople will have this checklist and check everything before it goes to the back office for processing. And just in their risk assessment, everything was fine. In back office risk assessment, everything was fine. When we put the two together, we found out that when this list get to back office, they recheck it all. So we're duplicating controls, we're duplicating the cost of those controls, and it actually serves no purpose. So whilst it's very good to do them individually, what I learned is when you look at the end-to-end process, you can find so many duplications and improvements that you can make that benefit all the departments in the whole process.
Thank you. While I've got your host, I'm going to direct you to a question that was raised during your session. Again, this was one from Tom, who was unfortunate to leave us, so hopefully you will get to see the response in the recording. Tom said he was interested in your opening about business structure and risk management. When involved in reviewing business procedures a few years ago, he pitched that we should consider building risk management into all of our procedures rather than having a standalone risk management procedure. This wasn't accepted at the time by the business. So Tom said he was interested in sort of what your views were on that, and the other panelists as well.
Good. I think, yes, it's a very good question. And I think it's important to look at that and have it built in. Sadly, his bosses did not accept it, but I would have just been insisting on it. One thing I learned very early in my career is if you want to be a good risk manager, you will never be everybody's friend. So sometimes you have to bite the bullet and say those kind of things. Personally, I found that built-in is definitely better than bolt-on. And we've seen that. There's a specific bank that I worked with in the Middle East where we started probably 15 years ago when I was working with them. We started to say, as a result of the risk culture thing, and we said, when do people call you when they want to implement a new system? IT call you 5 days before you go live. When do they call you when they want to launch a new product? 3 days before they go live. And you ask all these questions and you just hear risk is an obstruction to business. You don't want us to make money. So we took a conscious decision there that risk will be involved before the request for proposal go to the vendor, so that the risk requirements can be built into whatever system we buy. And that was a conscious decision from that day onwards. If vendors came to do their proposals and they came to do their demonstrations, risk was there. We had a thing which I called the risk technology framework, which was built into questions and requirements that was built into each request for proposal. It was included in each and every new product development upfront. And it was about 10 years after we started that particular bank was awarded some award for the best, most technologically advanced bank in the region. So it's a long process, but it definitely needs to be built in. This second phase bolt-on thing where you extract data and try and manage risk, I think we're way beyond that point.
Brilliant, thank you, Horst. So one of the final questions that we've got that was asked in advance in the chat was, we've seen social media affect wider culture in a significant way. Would any of the panelists like to share their views on whether they think newer technology are helping or could help with decision behaviours and risk culture?
I think from my point of view, social media and things like that are really increasing people's risk knowledge. Because if you think about when COVID started, everyone was talking about it on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and it was making people more aware of what was going on, and then they could evaluate the risk for themselves. So even though they didn't really know they were doing it, they were really doing kind of risk management. So that can get translated back into the organisation, and people who don't normally take part in risk, it might have gave them more confidence to take part in those conversations and be part of risk management.
Wes, did you want to go next?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, so yeah, completely agree with that about social media. Completely changed the entire culture. Everyone's an influencer now. Looking at in the professional world, I think the introduction of AI and the use of AI in business is, 2 months ago, it wasn't really anywhere, and now it's suddenly everybody's got AI. So certainly in NDA, we are exploring the use of AI, not artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence. So the ability to harness the power of data to give us some outputs, and it needs a human to make a decision needs a human to make a decision from it. But one of our team members showed us Microsoft Copilot. I don't know if anyone's had access to that just yet. It's a new thing from Microsoft that will be out within the next 12 to 24 months. And if you haven't seen it yet, when you do see it, be prepared to be worried about your job, because it is literally next level in terms of its ability to support people. It's an app that Microsoft are building that's got a natural language connection. You can drop a risk register into it and ask it simple English questions about the risk register, and it will provide you a response about its thoughts on that risk register. It opens up risk management to people who potentially don't have the competencies to a whole new world. So there's a whole avenue there that's just going to allow us as risk management professionals to change how easily accessible risk management information is. On the flip side of that, we've got things like ChatGPT and DALL-E and all those sorts of things, and the assumption of quality that comes out the back of it, the trust we have in what the computer says, the human assumption that there's the quality of output, what it's going to do to professions as you move along, the ethical use of it. Is there actually any original thought left? If somebody creates a risk management policy during ChatGPT and it becomes the global standard risk management policy, who's actually is it? Who's created that? And who owns all this stuff? So I think that massive curve, that massive steep, almost vertical line of development that's happening at the minute will be a huge change of culture, because we won't know what's real, what's human from not within a few months, I think.
Horst, did you have something to add?
Yes, I just wanted to give an example of what we had a few years already back, I think 2018 or so, from a risk conference in South Africa. We had a social media lawyer there, and she gave an example of an insurance company and how this insurance company actually used social media to manage risk. And her example was, this guy crashed his mother's car, and he put a picture on Facebook, and he said, "Crashed mom's car last night, luckily it's insured." He didn't have a license, so the mother put onto the claim form that she was driving. The insurance company picked this up from Facebook and said, "We ain't paying." So it's not just the education around it. I do agree there's a lot more information out there, and there's a lot more access to information out there. When I started this radical risk management process thinking of mine, I sent the PowerPoint to everybody who wants it, because to me, it's, the more people that actually use it, the better we get for the discipline at the management of risk, and there's no need for me to make any money out of it, so I just give it away. But there was just a practical example of how insurance companies are actually scanning social media to manage claims. And I think generally, probably all our organizations are scanning social media to manage reputational risk. I know our company for a fact have got social media scanners that will pick anything up that you say or publish about our company. So we're all using it for reputational risk, but I think the other positive side to learn and to easily learn from it. Just what we're doing now, we couldn't do this a few years ago, and it's great to talk to everybody in this way.
Martin?
So just stepping back to what Wes was talking about with the AI and that sort of stuff, not being an expert on it and not really digging into it, but listening to conversations, I get the feeling that a lot of the artificial intelligence stuff is looking back at information that has been generated and exists. And then I'm going to reach back into what Horst was talking about before. Are we going to go on that journey driving by looking through the rearview mirror, or are we going to look through the windscreen? So AI might be a useful tool for us, but if it's only based upon stuff that's happened in the past, we're not looking through that windscreen. Discuss.
Thank you, Martin. So that was, I think that was. Oh.
Sorry, I just wanted to say I agree. AI will add a lot to your fancy dashboard, but you still need to look through the windscreen.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brill. Thank you. So I think that probably covers off most of the questions that we had either in the chat and that people had sent us in advance. So I think that the main thing for me to say is probably to say thank you to all of our panelists. I think that's been a really useful webinar. There's a couple of comments in the chat, people saying how much they've enjoyed the webinar. So thank you to our panelists and thank you to our speakers for taking the time to put some slides together and talk to us and do like that bit of an intro at the beginning. We do have a survey, so I will post the link to the survey in the chat. If people, it should only take a couple of minutes to complete, so if people don't mind, we will greatly appreciate your feedback in the on the survey. There you go, it is now in the chat. And yeah, so brilliant. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our panelists. Hopefully see you all next time.